Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. So my last video one of my last videos, I opened up a bunch of packs of 1986 Donruss, and it was the first time I've done that in 30 years. And so for me, it was really just a series of memories, and I could remember exactly where I was in 1986, opening up 1986 Donruss packs for the first time. One thing I probably couldn't have known at the time in the 1980s when I was a modern collector was that Donruss was playing some really interesting games with their print runs, and I always tell you guys that the hobby has a lot to teach us. It's not just about the card themselves. One of the things that the hobby can teach you is basic economics. And today's video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about basic economics through Donruss. Now, in the 1980s, when I was collecting cards like this, and this is a really nice 1987 Donruss, the rookies, Greg Maddux, and I don't ever recall seeing this card. I may have once or twice, but didn't really give two thoughts about it. I never saw Greg Maddux pitch, unfortunately, but he is in the Hall of Fame. He is one of the greatest pitchers of his era, and this particular card is kind of interesting, I think. I do have a really interesting story about the rookies sets. Now, I did tell you guys that my teacher in the fourth grade, I believe it was the fourth grade, she had taken a bunch of us kids to the card shop to learn about math and problem solving skills. It's quite cool, actually. Just to think that, hey, maybe some of my students would benefit from this, especially the male students. So she took a bunch of us kids over to the card shop, and while my friends and classmates were going over modern cards and Bo Jackson and the major players of the late 1980s, I was, kind of like hanging over by the vintage section. I've never seen vintage cards before, so that to me is one of the reasons why I study vintage cards today, and it actually ended up being my second education. An education that I really should have had in school, and I've told you guys this before, but one of the things that I really learned about that was that cards, when they're usually not there at later on. So I really wanted to see if I could grab a vintage card, and a lot of tobacco cards were in that case. T205s, T206s, 1951 tops, and so I mowed a lot of lawns. I did things around the house to earn a couple of bucks, and I think at the time I ended up with like 15 or 16 bucks. So I think it was under 20 bucks. So when I went back to that shop, those cards weren't there that I saw, but now I had $15, and I saw these cards right here, actually a little box. I was like, you know what? I might as well just grab a box of these. I'll have the complete set. I believe it was 1988. And so the rookies, I had really no idea anything about it. I knew what Donruss was because it was one of my favorite sets. I really love Donruss. I love the design of the cards from the 1980s. And that's really what I collected. Uh, for me, 1984 Donruss were really off the table. Nobody that I knew had any, and I very rarely, if ever, saw any of those. 1985, again, they were pretty difficult to come across as well. 1986 Donruss, the first time I ever saw 86 Donruss was on my ninth birthday, and when my aunt gave me a bunch of packs, and I opened them up, and I found a Jose Canseco rookie card, and I really fell in love with the design of those cards and that set, and I really enjoyed the design of cards ever since, and I think it's one of the reasons why I actually went to school for design. So, um, you know, sometimes like they say, like people go into certain professions because they either saw Star Trek or they read a great book, and it kind of advanced their decision to go into a certain field. There really is no field for me to go into sports cards, but I became a writer because of my experience at that card shop, and it really gave me a second education through sports cards. I was really enjoying that rookies set that I got for $15, and I went back, I believe, like the next week or 2 weeks after. Whatever the case may be, that pack ended up being like $25, and I was like, wow, like that's really expensive. Like, how did that jump up like that, and why? So I think Becket really kind of played an important role in economics of the hobby and supply and demand. And so I had a sneaking suspicion, maybe a couple of years ago, that the company Donruss was short printing their sets on purpose. But I actually found something that kind of confirms this, and I want to share this with you guys today. And I will talk to you after I read this article. I think it's really interesting, so here we go. This is from the Daily Press, April 27th, 1985, Newport News, Virginia. Card Sharks by Charlie Den. It started as a trickle, a bare splash in the market which flowed uncontrolled for 3 decades by a rival company. But now the Donruss baseball card has become something of a conversation piece. To hobby card enthusiasts, it is the hottest item in the trading card line and is getting hotter almost daily. The reason is simply the law of supply and demand. Donruss cards, one of 3 sets of baseball cards distributed each spring, are published in limited supply. That means Donruss cards should appreciate in value far faster than those produced by rivals Flair and Topps. It's just like it is with any product, said Jan Becket, head of dealer relations for Donruss. You only produce so much of an item based on what you think the market will bear. We don't like to have an excess inventory at the end of the year. People will wait until you lower prices to reduce inventory and then buy. Donruss, which has been producing cards for 5 years, had an abundant supply of leftovers in each of its first 3 years. But last year, the company restricted the number of cards it printed, in essence selling out its product. Topps Chewing Gum Company had the monopoly on the market until Flair and Donruss entered the game in 1981. The two newcomers took Topps to court to dispute the exclusive right to distribute cards in packages of bubble gum. Flair and Donruss lost that suit, but the courts didn't say the two competitors couldn't produce cards, merely that they couldn't do it in packages containing gum. That may have been the stimulation Donruss executives needed. Forced to become more creative, they have hit upon some novel alternatives. Donruss invented the Diamond Kings series in 1982. It featured 26 cards, 1 player from each major league team, in portrait form as depicted by Dick Perez. That set, in its 4th year, is the most successful subset in card history. Perez co-owns the Perez Steel Art Gallery, which is the official artist for Major League Baseball's Hall of Fame, and his partner, attorney Frank Steele, a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School, is the man who initially got the gallery interested in Donruss cards. The president of Donruss Cards at the time, Stuart Lyman, called me to ask if our gallery would be interested in designing some special cards for their set, said Steele. I said that we would be delighted. The Donruss people had seen our first product, a limited edition of 10,000 sets of watercolor portraits of the Hall of Famers. The Diamond Kings cards are our idea, and they are the highest quality of any mass marketing product in the history of Major League Baseball. We feel that the Donruss cards have brought art back into baseball. Donruss has also created 2 new products for 1985. The larger size 5x7 card of the Diamond Kings cards and a set of 60 Action All-Stars. We realize the size 3.5 by 5 inches isn't that appealing, said Becket, but the cards aren't meant to replace our regular set, merely supplement them. The regular Donruss cards have become the fastest selling item locally. The local merchants who stock them literally have a hard time keeping a supply on hand. A friend asked me if I could stock baseball cards about 3 years ago, said Richard Cheney, owner of Pocosin Discount Pharmacy. I started getting them, and the Donruss cards have been the biggest seller. I have 5 or 6 people who come in regularly each week asking for them. I used to get just 1 box per week, but I'm ordering 6 boxes per week. When demand exceeds supply, you order more of an item. I think you could safely say it's been good for business. And Don Harrison, owner of the 10th Inning, a sports memorabilia and hobby card shop in Mercury Mall, has customers from as far as upstate New York who ask him to supply them with Donruss cards. Harrison, an avid collector on his own, has a theory as to why Donruss cards have made such an impact in the market. You can buy a vend case of Topps or Flair where you get 12,000 cards per case, he said. The cards are so mass-produced, they lose their appeal, but Donruss cards are produced in limited run. I think, ultimately, they will be worth 3 to 4 times what the Topps and Flair cards are. Topps is still the biggest seller, mostly because of its tradition, but Donruss is catching up fast. In an industry that nets roughly $20 million wholesale per year, that translates to big money. Donruss controls roughly 30% of the market now, with Topps owning around 50% of the sales. We're building our success slowly, said Steele, but our goal is to be the dominant card company in the market within 5 years. Don't bet your baseball card collection they won't. Supply and demand is one of the fundamental basics that everyone learns in business school. But, if you're in the hobby, this is one of the first things that you learn as a card collector is supply and demand. Well, when I was a kid picking up cards like this in the 1980s, I quickly found out supply and demand. And these cards, I didn't see a whole lot of them back in the day, and I still really don't see a lot of cards from the 1980s, except if they are superstars. Where do all the commons go from the 1980s and 1990s? Who has them? Landfills? Unfortunately, I think that's a very common occurrence that the majority of cards, if they're not stars, will end up in the trash, because collectors don't collect sets anymore. They don't complete sets. We today have a problem with the junk wax era 2.0. Now, they say that the junk wax era started in 1987 and it ended around 1991. I'm not entirely convinced of those dates. I think the junk wax era started in 1974 with new advances in printing, and a lot of these companies stopped using third-party printers and started printing these cards on their own, like Topps. And I think Topps started printing their own cards in about 1985. But for the most part, once these companies started to print on their own, they could print as many as they wanted without having to pay a third party to do so. And I think that's when you really started to see things really go out of control. 1987 really, to me, is one of the benchmark years for overprinting, especially with Topps. So, like, they have said that for every Topps card that was issued in 1987, there are 30 million of those. I'm not entirely sure that that's a correct estimation, but it is in the millions. When you look over the population reports, I kind of sprinkle that with a grain of salt because a lot of people crack open their cases and they send them in to get a higher grade, and what that actually does is it skews the population reports. So I only use it to have an example of what may be out there. It's not the total of cards that are out there. It's impossible to actually grade every single card. That would be unnecessary and extremely expensive, and you wouldn't have a $10 card graded, or at least I don't think you would, or a $5 card or a $3 card. That just does not make any sense from an economic standpoint. Grading to me doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for the majority of cards anyway. That really should be reserved for certain cards if they're extremely rare. And the cards I have back here are not rare by any stretch of anybody's imagination whatsoever. They're out there. I've seen quite a number of them. They're all quote unquote junk wax era cards for the most part. And that term, I'd love to know who actually coined the term junk wax era. I think it's actually worse now than when I was a kid. The junk wax era, I think, never stopped, but it's just a different take on something that I grew up with. It's just a little bit different, and again, like I said, I think it's a lot worse now. And I don't know how any modern collector can complete a set. I think it's nearly impossible with these numbered sets, the numbered cards, one of one. That's not very fun. One of one cards are actually really, or they should be, in theory, really difficult to get an accurate price for because what Jim Becket did back in the 1970s, 1977, 1976, around there, was to come up with a mathematical formula for what the card was actually going for. And he'd go around to multiple cities with questionnaires for dealers. They'd sign off on how many cards were sold specifically and then send it back to Becket. And he would come up with his formula for the average price of that specific card or a specific set, and that's how you knew exactly what these cards were going for back in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think it was a very it's very good way to know exactly what the cards were going for, or what you should pay for the card and what the dealer should sell it for. And now it's free for all, and people are using comps for vintage, which I don't think you can do comps for vintage. I don't even think you can do comps for other rare cards as well. And they're just going off of regular sales of what the card sold for the last time, and that's really difficult as well. what if it's a ungraded card, a raw card? I mean, there's two different prices for the same card, and that can get really confusing. Um, and so I don't think it's a very good uh, economic model to have two prices for the same exact card just because one is graded and one is ungraded. That didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me in the 1980s, and actually even in the late 1970s. You see a lot of cards that are spiking in price, and I'm not entirely sure what is going on here, why this is happening. My gut feeling is that there are a lot more card shops that are being opened, and you have the Topps monopoly that has just broken up in 1980, and then you have Donruss and Flair that are manufacturing cards, and you definitely see the emergence of the investor getting into the hobby, and you also have a lot of, regular press that are writing articles in the late 1970s and early 80s saying, hey, cards are all of a sudden worth money. You can get money for this stuff. So these reporters, I think they're mostly like general interest stories, right? So they'll report on every single thing under the sun. And a lot of these guys, they're like, hey, I used to collect cards when I was a kid. Now they're worth something. Oh my God. Where have I been? And so it's kind of like a layman's look at the hobby. And for a guy like me or a guy and gal like you, you guys follow the hobby, maybe the history of it as well, and you guys are a little bit more informed than a lot of these reporters are. So to me, I kind of got a chuckle out of that, because they're saying, oh my God, these cards are worth a lot of money now, 35 cents, 40 cents, whatever, $1.50. But they really are not in tune with the hobby like you or I would be, just because we're in it and they're not. And the one thing that I think I'm starting to see in the early 1980s is that investors have come in, and once that happens, you have your true collectors on one side and your investors on the other side, and the investors are the ones who are jacking up the prices of these cards, and then later on it just has disastrous effects. It was one of those magazines back in the early 1980s, 1981, I believe, when Flair came out with their set for the first time, and this investor had liquidated his funds and just bought nothing but 1981 Flair and put them in a safe deposit box, waiting for these cards to go up in value enough so that he could retire. Well, that was not a good idea. I mean, you're looking at it 40 plus years later. We know how that story went, but even in like 1982, the market was kind of shaky for Flair's first year, and then Donruss, when they entered that suit against Topps in 1980. So that suit, the lawsuit actually was from 1975 through 1980, and then the decision happened in 1980, and it allowed both those companies to issue cards. But Donruss, well, they were there too, but they weren't a major factor. They were just kind of like on the heels of Flair. They're the ones that really did a lot of the legwork on that suit. And it's kind of like one of my favorite lawsuits when it comes to card manufacturing. There are actually a number of lawsuits that I really enjoy diving into when it comes to the hobby. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but through through the hobby, I have learned a lot about the law, and it's all because of the fact that I walked into a card shop one day, and I saw these tobacco cards, T205s, T206, and that kind of like got me going into wanting to learn more about the players and the cards themselves, and you know. You never know where you're going to go in life, and for me, sports cards has taken me on several very interesting detours, if you will, and there's a lot to learn through the hobby, and art is one of them, history is another, economics is another one that you easily learn. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in that article was that the guy believed that Donruss was going to be worth more money than Topps and Flair just because they were lowering the supply of their cards. And we really don't know what the exact amount of cards that were issued by each company were, with the exception of the Tiffany sets. We definitely know what the majority of those sets were printed. So 1987 for Topps was a luxury year. Apparently, they printed just way too many cards, and again, this is represented in the population reports. But again, and take those with a grain of salt. It does give us a little bit of an idea of what is going on with the card sets of the 1980s and how many are or were issued. My problem, though, is obviously not just taking a card out and sending it back into the company. It is the fact that certain card sets from the 1980s are they're plain ugly. The 1986 Flair, not a good looking set. So you have really undesirable card sets from the 1980s. 1983 Flair is another one. I kind of like it, but some people or most people probably don't. So that's going to affect the population as well. And you can't grade every card, but it does give us a nice glimpse into what's going on. So when I was going to school, there really weren't any economics courses that I could take, and today only 40% of all high school kids have taken an economics course, and the understanding of economics today is very, very low compared to what it was in the past. I learned economics through the hobby, and it has been very fun, at least I think. And that's the one thing about education. For me, growing up, education was it wasn't good. I'll just put it to you that way. I didn't really have a very good formal education because of my disability. However, again, the hobby has really taught me quite a bit of things outside of the hobby, if you will. Art is one of them. Economics is another. How to communicate properly with somebody to close a deal. So 40% of all high schoolers have a basic understanding of simple economics, and that's actually lowered to, I believe, 16% nationwide for everybody between the ages of 18 and, like, say, 60. So our understanding of economics and how the economy actually works is very low. It's too low, in my estimation, to have a functioning population where we are not going to end up in something like communist China or a socialist society, and where nobody knows where their dollar is actually coming from. The better understanding you have of economics, the freer you're going to be, and governments understand this. They realize this, and it may be one of the reasons why that we really don't teach economics in school. Because if people knew, if people knew that where their freedoms come from. They come from God, not from a government. You know, the Constitution, right? Um, People don't read the Constitution like they should. They don't read uh, how the country was founded. They don't read up on simple, basic economics. They're not taught these things. And you know, when I was a kid in school, I really wasn't taught these things. I had to learn on my own. And for me, you know, being disabled was probably the greatest thing that ever happened to me. To tell you the truth, I have a different outlook on things than I may have or I would have had I not been disabled. And so I say that uh, you know, when one door closes, another one opens, and you never know in which direction your life is going to go into. For me, baseball cards has really been a godsend, if you will. It really has opened up my eyes to things that I normally wouldn't have been subject to. And again, sometimes being at the right place at the right time is a great thing. Um, and I just never would have expected that I would have done something like this. If it wasn't for Dustin, the personal sports card dad. Thanks, Dustin. I really appreciate it. You know, this medium can be a real pain in the ass. It really can, especially editing. I hate editing, but there's a lot here within the hobby that I can work with to tell you guys about. And this article that I read to you guys is 40 years old, hidden somewhere in a dusty newspaper. And you know, who knows how long it would have been for somebody to come across that article again 40 years later and read it. And you know, there's a lot of hobby aspects or history of the hobby that kind of disappear over time because, you know, out of sight, out of mind. One thing our hobby pioneers really didn't do very well, I think, was to teach hobby history. If you're going to get into a hobby and spend a lot of money on cards, the first thing you need to understand is how that card was printed, when it was printed, not just the money. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot of education that comes along with collecting vintage. And now these cards are vintage. They're well, this one's like what, 37 years old, and well, that would make sense. I was 10 years old in 1987. You know, me and math, just we don't really see eye to eye on a lot of things. That's another story altogether that someday I'll tell you guys about. I'm I've made it this far. I've made it this far in life, not to be completely stupid, but my formal education really didn't help me all that much. It showed me the basics of how to live, but the rest of it, I think, came through sports cards. I really believe so, in a weird kind of way. And then things that happen through average everyday life. And sometimes you just can't prepare yourself, no matter how much training you get, no matter how much education you have behind you. I always say, you know, you will learn from the very first day you're born to the very last day that you live. You will be learning, and it, you know, your formal education, they will teach you the basics, but they won't teach you everything. They can't teach you everything. So I would suggest that if you are in the hobby, especially, go to shows, take notes, take photographs, study the cards that you want for your collection, study the ball players that you want to add to your collection. And the more you know, the least likely it is that you're going to get ripped off. Because as a collector, you guys and girls spend a lot of money on your collections. And what I've noticed over the last 40 some odd years of collecting is that the hobby kind of like goes around in circles. It's like a dog chasing its tail. A lot of things today collectors think are new ideas, and they're really not new. What we're seeing now is a lot of card collectors getting back into the hobby after decades, perhaps. And I never I never got out of the hobby. I just changed from modern to vintage. That's all I did. But there's a huge gap for me in which I don't really know any of the modern players. I don't really know anything that's going on for the most part with modern. I try to follow this stuff through Dustin, the personal sports card dad, and other channels to try to keep me up to date on a lot of this stuff. But for the most part, I never really collected modern after 1994, and so there's a huge gap there. I never really even watched sports, and I still don't really watch sports at all either. And you're like, well, how can you be a collector if you don't watch sports? Well, it's very easy. I'm a student of history, and I do study the players of the past and the cards and the manufacturing of those cards and history. So I do enjoy the hobby that way. And as Dustin had said, and I think it's very accurate too, is every modern card is going to be vintage at some point. And so what is going to happen is that the modern cards today that they're buying and selling and spending a lot of money for, that's not going to be the case 20, 30, 40 years from now. Very few of those cards are actually going to maintain and hold their value. The majority of these cards that we're collecting, buying and selling, they're probably going to end up in the trash. You know, I went through this when I was first getting into modern cards when this particular card was issued in 1987. The majority of 1987 tops are they're in the trash. At least I kind of think that they should be. I have a love-hate relationship with 1987 tops. I really do. But my point is that collectors today are not buying and selling 1980s cards as my generation was when we were kids. That's just not happening. And I'm not telling you guys not to collect modern cards today. What I'm saying is that we're going through a junk wax era 2.0, and it's a lot worse than it was when I was collecting 1987 tops, Donruss, whatever the case may be. There's a lot more cards, I believe, today that are going to be found in near mint condition or better in the future. So I usually have a cup of coffee with a guy named Hank. He's in his 90s. He holds 4 degrees under his belt, and he used to be a teacher, a very smart guy. But he has said something that I think is universal throughout, not just with the hobby, but he's always telling me that you have to be careful of the advice that you get. You know, not all advice is good advice, and you have to watch out for the people who are actually giving you the advice, whether or not what that advice is doing is to benefit them or you. So just keep that in mind. And when I was a modern collector in the 1980s and early 1990s, we had our share of scoundrels, if you will. A lot of bigwigs back then that are nowhere to be seen now. And, there was a lot of gimmicks, a lot of people who are just out to make money. How does that saying go? A fool and their money are soon departed. Well, that happened quite a bit back in the 1980s and the 1990s when it came to the hobby. And, I was lucky. I only lost $15 on that the 1980, I believe it was at 88, Donruss, the rookies. I understand there's a lot of dealers who they might not know everything about the hobby, and obviously, like, you can't know everything about the hobby, but at the same time, if you're going to get into vintage, you need to study. You really need to study the players. You need to study everything about the card that you want to purchase. And so don't just trust one source. Do your own research and go with your gut. And I guarantee you guys, people will lie to you. Your gut will never lie to you. Your heart might. Your brain, that's another story. So, there's times in which my heart was lying to me all the time about a card or another situation, usually with a girl. That's another story. But your heart can lie to you. You may really fall in love with a certain card, and it might not be in your economic best interest to purchase that card. Now, purchasing cards for an investment is a lot different than purchasing cards for the love of the card, being a true collector, because you do have collectors and I'd say dealers really, who are in it for the money, and they could be selling socks. Doesn't matter, a sock or a card is really the same thing to them. It's just a dollar sign. And Alan Mr. Mint Rosen is a perfect example of that. He didn't see cards as the way you or I would see them. He saw them as a dollar sign, and that was it. He was very good with economics, I would say. There's a lot of those kind of guys out there. Again, Mr. Mint is a guy that I knew for 20 years. I don't see them as a bad guy. I understood exactly who he was. And you come across a lot of those guys in the hobby. And, people come and go. And that's how it is. Nothing is finite. So again, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it, as always. Let me know in the comment section below what you make of this article. If you have any memories specifically to the 1980s in regards to this article, or anything that I've said in this video, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Until the next time, I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye.